It's 6:30. It's July 23rd. I open the Planning Commission meeting for the month of July. Our first item on the agenda, first off, we have two vacancies that are not here. Commissioner Schwab is not here, and also our Greg Wassinger, our committee chair, is also vacant, they're not here tonight. With that, the first item of business would be to approve the minutes of May 28th. I'm sorry, June 25th.
I move that we approve the minutes of the regular business meeting from June 25th, 2019.
We have a motion to approve. We have a second. Need a second? We have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, thank you. Second item on our agenda will be the public comment. Are there any general comments from the public that wish to speak on any item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to the first public hearing. This is the Village of Geary Oak preliminary plat. This is a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing. This is a continuation from our last meeting of June 25th.
So, Mr. Vice Chair, as you can see from the staff report, staff is recommending this time that you continue the hearing to a date certain, which is the August 27th meeting. Applicant is working diligently to be ready for the Planning Commission. We're working with them. I think we have every expectation that the application will be before you at the August 27th meeting. And, I'm sorry, and a motion and a second and a vote is appropriate.
Yes.
For the record.
So I'll entertain a motion to continue this item to our next month's meeting.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I move that we continue this public hearing until the August meeting of the Planning Commission.
Second.
We have a motion to continue. We have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, thank you. Our next item on the agenda is for the 6-year Transportation Improvement Program. CAC?
Good evening, CAC Mac Senior Planner. Normally the Planning Commission would have a public hearing on this, but I think in my memo I drafted to the Planning Commission, I talked about the not having the need to do a public hearing, and I thought I'll provide the Planning Commission with some extra information so that it's captured on TV and anybody that's interested can watch it and find out. So this was a sort of a step that the city did for quite a while, and it was based on a slight misunderstanding of what needs to be done. So what we do, we are part of an RTPO with the Island County, and the state requires that federally funded projects come from the city to the RTPO. The RTPO compiles all that information and then forwards it to the state, and the state is required to form a state transportation improvement program. And so this document kind of lists all the federally funded programs from all the counties, all the RTPOs, and all the cities. What they required was that the list of projects that cities and RTPOs come forward with should come from an approved list of projects. And for us, it is the CIP. We go through the capital improvement planning process every year. The Planning Commission considers it. We have all our transportation projects, our park projects, and all our projects are listed through there. It goes through a public hearing process, and we take action in December. So that's our approved list. So in order to send our projects from the city to the RTPO, we are in sync with our CIP in the list of projects we send. And as long as that list is synced up, we shouldn't have any discrepancies in sending that list to the county. In the past, it was because it was asked from an approved list of projects, our engineering department brought this forward as in approving the list that we're sending to the county, and I don't think that step is necessary. So the projects that we send to the county are projects that are in the CIP, and they are projects that are federally funded. So all we need to do is just send a list of these approved projects to the county, and it's a very administrative task, and it doesn't require a hearing or anything like that. So we found that out. We thought, okay, we can save a step. We do a lot of discussion of our projects at the CIP, and that is sufficient to satisfy the requirement to forward this list to the county. So a public hearing and an extra step on an extra adoption and ordinance is not required for this. However, I thought I'll share the list of projects that we send to the county. It's just a spreadsheet. It's a state-operated website spreadsheet, and our engineering department fills in all the projects that we have federal funds for, which we usually get from the RTPO. There's very specific dollars. This is in sync with our CIP. There's no differences in any of the amounts, or there's no differences in any of the projects, so we don't have to repeat that step. But I'll share the list that we'll send to the county so that the Planning Commission is aware. We'll do the same with the City Council as well. So as long as the project that we're sending to the county is coming from the CIP, Capital Improvements Project, we shouldn't have to go through this step of reapproving an already approved list of projects. So it's an unnecessary step, but I have copies for your information.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks.
Thank you.
The three projects that we have federal funds for currently are the Northeast 7th Avenue reconstruction, the Heller Street, and the Waterfront Trail Enhancement Project. The Waterfront Trail Enhancement Project is for the VFW Park, where we had the slide a few years ago. Northeast Avenue, we've got some funding for engineering and for the design. We are still, we want to apply for the construction dollars as well. That opportunity hasn't come up yet. And Heller Street is programmed for 2023 and 2024 for some work. So this is consistent with our CIP, and this is what we're forwarding to the county. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Any questions? Any question? This public hearing was canceled,
Yes.
so, but this is informational.
Yes.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
That concludes that item. Now we're moving to the final item, design guidelines update.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Ray Lindenberg, Associate Planner. I'm just going to give you a brief update on what our progress is with regard to the Main Street Association and their request to make some changes to the design guidelines for the downtown area, the CBD. And so I'm just going to kind of go through this. If you have any questions or anything that come up in the meantime, go ahead and shout them out, and we'll make a little discussion out of this. So it was a couple months ago that I talked to you, so if you're not remembering anything, like I said, I can help out with that, but just a very brief background. Main Street Association developed a document that they submitted to us. We gave that copy to you. It was kind of two different sections. One that was text, talked about kind of aspirational things that they wanted to see for the downtown area. And then the second portion was very graphics intensive, lots of photos, kind of describing what it is that they'd like to see in the downtown area. And when we made the presentation to you, we kind of went over the overall outline of that proposal, the introduction, guiding principles, et cetera, all the things that were in that, and then came back and kind of gave you an overview of what's in the existing DRG document, the Design Regulations and Guidelines, to kind of show that we are working through some of those things, and what the Main Street Association had presented to us was kind of already there. It was maybe something that we could fit together instead of trying to create something new. So what we have there is, in the DRG, we had the why, when, and how, and that's kind of the outline of how the document works. sections for specific development types, like multifamily housing or commercial, et cetera. And then there's some neighborhood-specific ones that include the harbor area that is the downtown area. And then it talks a little bit about some of the built-in flexibility with the ability to make certain variations to that the design guidelines and regulations, or regulations and guidelines, are not set in stone, and there's something that can be a little bit of flexibility to. So like I said, we discussed that there was a little bit of overlap between the Main Street Association proposal and the Oak Harbor DRG, and that within that, because the Main Street Association proposal is so specific and the Oak Harbor DRG is very broadly based and serves the entire city, then we have this kind of narrow area that overlaps there. And when we look at the details, again, because the proposal from the Main Street Association was very, very detailed. There was a lot of work done there to get really down into the details, into the weeds, if you will. And so I want to kind of take this as a minute to kind of compare and contrast the two. When you look at the proposed guidelines on the left-hand side there, that's the Main Street Association one, and we have the existing DRG document on the right-hand side. So on the left there, with the proposed guidelines that were submitted to us, we have an intent and guiding principles, we have some general goals and strategies, and we have identification of significant amenities. On the right-hand side, we have our why, when, how statement, and a purpose statement in each section, and then the criteria for fitting in with existing design without specific examples. And what I'm showing here, and what we'll show through this presentation, is kind of that specificity of the proposed guidelines and the general nature of ours, and kind of showing how those will work together or can work together to be folded into each other. So where the proposed guidelines have kind of identification of significant amenities downtown, it talks about Mailer's Dock and how that was a loss to the community and how we should be working towards rebuilding things like that. The existing document talks about criteria that fit into the existing neighborhood without making specific recommendations like the proposal did. We have the implementation on the left-hand side. It talks about a historic survey, which we have done going through the process of getting our Historic Preservation Commission into place. So that's something that's kind of already done. It talks about branding, and it talks about major elements within the downtown area. And it talks about specific, again, uses within the downtown area. And you see a big white arrow there, and that will come into play a little bit later in my presentation. And an existing DRG document doesn't specifically address things within the DRG. However, again, the recent code amendment that created the HPC, and that's going back to the implementation section within the proposed guidelines that they submitted to us. Now, I don't want you to read all this right now because I'm going to talk about them, and I'm not going to read them either, so don't worry about that. So on the left-hand side, those were the kind of outlined sections of the document that they submitted to us, and it talks about very specific things. On the right-hand side are some of the quotes that are found within the DRG and how they will relate together, and what I'm hoping to show is that what we have within our DRG is already, again, kind of folded into what we can see that's in the design or the proposed guidelines there. So the first one, buildings shall incorporate materials and details that are fitting with the Pacific Northwest. And what that's saying is that your future development that we're reviewing with the DRG document needs to fit in with the existing neighborhood. And that was one of the key components that was in the proposed guidelines as well. And they talk about color, detail, and texture, pattern, rhythm, proportion, streetscape, building facades, all those sorts of things. And so that is something that's already been addressed by our DRG and something that we review off of. We look at neighboring buildings, we look at buildings in the area. Some of the submittals that we've had recently have been very detailed in showing us, hey, this is how our building fits in because these are other buildings in the area that have these details and these different textures and patterns and things like that. So the second quote from DRG there, building entrances, walkways, and facades shall be designed to relate to neighboring buildings and establish a coherent development pattern that is people-oriented. Another one of the strong things about the DRG talks about people-oriented. They want to see parking lots recessed in the back, behind the buildings, off to the side, et cetera, with pedestrian entrances and pedestrian amenities on the front to create a human scale, which is one of the things in the proposed guidelines, to create a aesthetically pleasing streetscape, working on the facades and the details, and then having street furniture, public art, murals, things like that, and awnings and canopies to protect people as they go into buildings. Another quote from the existing DRG, locate main entrances and display windows near to and facing the street with direct walking route from the street or from the sidewalk. Again, talking about pattern, rhythm, and proportion, human scale, streetscape, all of these things kind of start, sounding very similar because they are, typical kind of sound planning ideas that we've been working with for a long time, and architects have been working with, and planners have been working with, and these are things that people want to see in their community. Another one, incorporate similar or complementary patterns from existing development within the neighborhood and adjacent streets. Again, that color rhythm, pattern, detail, texture, all those things folding in together. The proposed guidelines were very specific, and they had photos and examples and things like that, whereas the DRG document is very kind of general. Fit into the neighborhood. How does that work? And that kind of is left up to the reviewing person, either myself or one of our other planners, to kind of make that determination. It allows a little bit of flexibility and a little give and take. What is, modern architecture, or what is Pacific Northwest architecture, or what is appropriate to a neighborhood, and that's going to differ by everybody. But at the same time, it's kind of a different philosophy as allowing that flexibility versus being very prescriptive in what it is you're supposed to have, a checklist, if you will. Another quote from the DRG, blank walls are not permitted, all walls must have visual interest. And again, that's going back to the human scale, the building facades and the details. One of the specific things that the proposed guidelines talked about was murals. We've got murals that are going up on walls right now, and they're fantastic. So that's something that we're addressing kind of within the community itself, even without looking at the DRG document. It's something that building owners are taking care of themselves because they want to beautify and make things more attractive within the downtown area. Window displays are required to cover a majority of the front facade. Now, this is where that split starts to happen. I want to discuss a little bit, is that the existing DRG talks about how much window space you have to have. You have to have display windows. It doesn't talk about what's in those display windows, and that's where the proposed document gets a little bit deeper into the details. And honestly, I don't know that it's someplace that we can go as a city telling people what they're allowed to have in their window displays. So that's kind of the dividing line, is we can go up to the sidewalk and tell you what the front of your building needs to look like, but we can't tell you what the inside of your building needs to look like. So that's one of those things where it starts to reach a little bit further in, I think, than I'm comfortable with as far as trying to regulate design and aesthetics within the downtown area. And then finally, it talks about entrances shall be articulated. Another one of the specific things it talks about in the proposed guidelines are awnings and canopies, and that's something we encourage as well. There is another section within the DRG document that talks about requiring awnings and canopies to protect pedestrians while they're walking in and out of buildings. So these are some of the kind of details that you see when you set the two documents side by side. You see that while the DRG document is very general in its nature, it is addressing all of the very fine details that you find in the proposed document. And so one of the other kind of things that I look at when I see our existing DRG on the right-hand side is the page that addresses the downtown area, the one page. And it's literally a column, and it's very brief. And I understand that that might not look real good optically to people saying, hey, we're trying to improve our downtown. All we have is this one little column regarding what our design criteria are. So maybe we need to beef that up. I think that would be a good idea. So maybe take some of the information that is in the proposed guidelines and talk about a zoning ordinance revision as well. Because a lot of what is in those proposed guidelines has to do with land use. And I know that that has been a kind of continuing discussion, is we need to look at what land uses are going to be allowed within the downtown area and start kind of investigating that information. So what I would propose at this point, and what we've discussed as staff, is kind of twofold, is splitting this off into two separate projects. Adding some detail elements to the existing DRG to address some of the design concerns and ideas and thoughts and things like that that came to us from those proposed guidelines that were obviously very well thought out and presented to us. And then also going off in a different direction to deal with a zoning ordinance revision to look at the uses and some of those kind of non-design issues that did come up within that document. So at this point, I think that's what we're looking at for moving forward. I'm going to start drafting the revisions to the DRG document, and then following soon after, I'll present that information to you all, and then I'll start working on a zoning ordinance revision too, and we'll kind of keep those separate so as not to confuse the two issues, because I think that's kind of what happened when this was submitted to us, is there's a little bit of kind of blurring of the lines of what we want to get into and what is design and what is zoning and uses and things like that. So I think that's what the ultimate goal is here, is to take that chart again and kind of split it up a little bit and get us to a similar goal where we were talking about before, which is improving the design guidelines, but also improving the zoning ordinance so that, you know, we've come back, we started out with one goal, we kind of split it, and we come back to the same place where we've improved the downtown area by improving the design and also looking at those uses. So, yeah.
Ray, so when the Main Street Association came in and their proposal was very detailed and very impressively detailed, if this proposal gets approved and these guidelines get implemented, is the onus going to be only on the city to implement these guidelines, or is Main Street planning on assisting or being a part of the decisions? They're a national organization. They got a lot of resources. Obviously, they did a lot of homework on this proposal. Is that the plan, or is it solely going to be on the city to tell people colors, styles, that sort of thing?
Honestly, that's a philosophical thing that we needed to get into. And as part of the process of making these revisions, we will be discussing it with the Main Street Association. Here's what we have in mind. And it will still be a public hearing so that comments can be made. From my standpoint, I think talking about restricting colors and things like that is starting to get a little bit too far. But that's just my opinion. If that is something that people feel strongly about, then we can certainly investigate it. I know that there was a lot of, you can't really say discussion, but a lot of thought put into color and things like that in that document. Our document says very generally that it needs to be Pacific Northwest and fit in with the neighborhood. So if you see a lot of red brick or a lot of a particular paint color, then maybe that's something you need to, you know, incorporate into your design if we're reviewing it just by the DRG as it is now. And so maybe we're getting to the same place without saying it specifically.
Right, and it seems like those, the people that are in the Main Street Association would be on board with these proposals and would be seeking, counsel, help.
Sure.
To try and do it the best way possible. I'm just, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just to kind of further answer your question there, Main Street is a volunteer organization that we help fund with B&O tax to revitalize the downtown. They're they're a nonprofit, not a regulatory organization, but certainly their input's welcome in efforts in revitalizing, but they're not in the issue like we are in regulating and going through the process. They did also advocate for the Historic Preservation Commission, and the Historic Preservation Commission, as it moves forward, may take more of an active role of what you see in the downtown. And that's the avenue that might be more strengthening on the regulatory and on the design issues that they have. The trade-off there in talking to Steve on this is sometimes they want to revitalize the downtown. If you restrict what goes in there, then you're making it more difficult. So it's trying to get that right balance where we encourage the right kind of business that really revitalize, but yet be open enough that property owners can be able to get businesses in there, because if you do some of the zoning, that's going to be restrictive, the more things you have. So it's trying to get that right balance here and use these design guidelines to really help change the aesthetics. It's really vital to revitalize into downtown, but yet be flexible enough that they can move forward and they can have the flexibility to fill space in the downtown, which is an issue.
Yeah, it seems like it should be a collaboration instead of a you have to do this kind of a
Yeah,
deal.
and this is a good collaboration effort, and the compliment I want to take staff is for taking the recommendations and really putting it and applying for it and taking that organization, which is very vital organization, and there was a lot of time and effort and really putting it together and going through this process. So I want to thank Ray and Steve for really pushing that through and really looking at their components here and really taking their input here in efforts to revitalize the downtown ultimately is our goal.
Thanks, Glenn.
So when do builders or developers typically first see the design regulations and guidelines?
It depends on how they approach us, to be honest. When somebody comes in, say somebody comes in, for instance, to talk to me in our office downstairs about a piece of property that's available and they're thinking about building there, what I will generally tell them is, okay, you're in this zone district, and there are design criteria as well, so you probably want to take a look at that. And it depends, again, on who it is that's asking. If it's just mom and pop who've come in and thought, hey, it'd be kind of cool to build a restaurant here, or whatever that is, or if it's somebody who has kind of a higher level of understanding of the development process, it's going to kind of change what that reaction is. The other thing that I always tell people when they're serious about purchasing a property or moving forward with a development is to go through our pre-application review process. And at that time, we get a conceptual drawing. They submit a conceptual drawing, and it can be pretty basic, or it can be very well, fleshed out at that point. That we send it around to be reviewed by our different departments. And one of the things, if they have not obviously, thought about it as far as the design is concerned, the exterior design, is I say, hey, here's a copy of this, because we meet after the process has gone through. And we meet and we talk about it, and I say, here's a copy of the design regulations and guidelines. Review this, pay particular attention to this. It looks like you've got a parking lot out front and that doesn't work, or whatever it may be. So we go through that pretty early in the process with them. That's the first kind of official notification. If they've come in and talked to me before, I will generally notify them of that need, and that there is a DRG document. A lot of architects and designers who have worked with us before are aware of that, but I still remind them.
So obviously you get quite a wide variety. You get folks from the mom and pop, like you're talking about, to on the other extreme, developers who have built on similar sites in similar communities all over the place, and they have quite a different approach. They may come with their plans already kind of roughed out.
Right.
And this proposal by Main Street really only applies to one page out of the 30 pages in this design regulations and guidelines, right? It only applies to the Harborside District. So,
Well, go ahead.
So, if people have done a little bit of research before they get to you, and all they've got is the one page to go with, I'm concerned that, maybe they're having to start over again, maybe do a little bit more work than if a lot of the Main Street stuff was included in. A lot of the things that you guys produce have great appendixes, and I think it would be a fantastic appendix to be able to say, refer to these examples in the appendix for examples, not necessarily guidance, but just examples.
Yeah.
Because I really like what the Main Street did, and to be able to say, for example, exactly like you did on your slides here are some examples of how these different functions apply to each of the different categories on this one page.
Right. And I think the way I envision it is fleshing out that one page into several pages, because it's clearly lacking in kind of guidance. The thing is about it too is there is information in other pages within the DRG that will apply. And sometimes people kind of go straight, they'll look up the table of contents, see Harborside, go straight to that and ignore the rest. Right. So that is something that, we kind of have to do a little behavior modification on. But there is information throughout the rest of that document that will apply. But in order to really strengthen a design process for the downtown area specifically, we need to flesh that out more clearly. So,
well, some of the definitions, like, what does Pacific Northwest design mean? Mm-hmm. To some people, it may mean red brick. To me, it doesn't. It means more stone and wood. And, You know, so I think having examples of what some of these categories really mean is really helpful.
Yeah,
And it gets towards what the Main Street is trying to get to.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's back to one of Ray's previous comments. It's an important one, and I think it bears repeating, which is that the current document applies, many of the sections in the current document apply within the central business district, not just that single page. And so I just want to make sure the commission doesn't have any misconceptions about that. The other thing, which is somewhat interesting and somewhat of a complicating factor, but I think we will be looking at it when we break off into the code amendment side dealing with the uses, is that there are some specific design standards for the central business district which are embedded in the zoning code. And those were very purposefully put there, obviously, and those are more rigid because they are code. They're not as flexible as our guidelines, and so those apply also. So that's a companion document, I guess, is my point.
Is it worth, you know, referencing them each? You know, so that you can say, as a person's going through this, you know, you also need to reference this section of the code?
Maybe it's a good idea. It does go the other way. It's referenced in the zoning code that you have to follow the design guidelines. And we know that we have some cleanup to do that will probably only really seem like it will matter to us, where we reference the design guidelines as a particular place in the code. So we actually see an opportunity to clean up a couple of pieces that make both of these documents work better, our guidelines and our code. So by the time we get to the end of this project, I think we'll have a collective product that's easier to understand and more clearly defines what the community's vision is for downtown.
The way I'm looking at this is, isn't this single document being presented to have the applicants ask questions where you can assist them in going down these various paths? You need to look at this, you need to look at that, rather than sometimes a document like this could be more confusing because you know what is. But I think it's an opportunity for them, okay, I have a question about this, so this one document tells me I need to ask you some more questions and be very specific. Is
Yeah.
that what it's geared for?
And like I said before, it's kind of philosophical, right? So we can use the document as kind of a starting point for a conversation, or we can use a document for a checklist. You need to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to look at your plans, make sure X, Y, and Z are on there. Or, you know, we can talk about it and say, well, you know, it would be nice if you had X, but if you can't do that, maybe you do A, and B instead, and that will, you know, kind of make up for it. There's a little bit of give and take there, a little bit of flexibility. And from my standpoint, I think that allows for a little bit more creativity. The architecture in this city is not kind of monolithic. Like if you were to go over to Port Townsend and talk about red bricks, that's great, red bricks. But when you come here and you see kind of an eclectic mix of modern, like this building, and you know, older buildings like the Loft building and the Old Town Mall and things like that, there's a variety here. And so a lot of different things can fit in if they're designed well. And the thing is that I like to say is good design is good design. That it doesn't matter if it has red brick on it or if it has, you know, stone or whatever the exterior material is. If the design is sound, then it's a sound design. And that's really what it comes down to for me. And so if it fits into the neighborhood and it makes sense and it's appropriate, I think that's a good starting point.
I think that's a good point, and it, you know, goes back to my point, which is, I grew up in the Northeast. Red brick is Northeast also.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use a term like Pacific Northwest, let's define some of the elements that make that up.
Sure.
Any other comments?
I have a half-baked idea.
Okay.
Is it odd that we're going to have this design, this DRG that really is going to have such a large focus on the downtown area and not all the other neighborhoods that have been identified in the city? And in other words, is it weird to have several pages for downtown and very little for everything else? Or would it make more sense for the downtown piece to remain its current size and point people to this other document that expands on that?
from my standpoint in reviewing things, I would like to keep it in one document just for simplicity's sake.
Sure.
I understand what you're saying, though, and maybe this is the opening conversation to making the rest of the design guidelines better or expanding more. Or maybe we look at it and say, well, downtown is a unique kind of design itself because you have the buildings right up against the street and you have a more urban kind of fabric than you do on Midway. Midway is one of the ones that's identified in the document there. So maybe we don't need to. I mean, maybe it does need more detail because it's a more detailed place.
Another
Okay.
way to answer that question is playing off of something that Ray said before. He said good design is good design. If our existing design review guidelines apply across the community, and there are some basic principles in there that yield good products when they're followed, right? Placement of the building, not having the parking lot between the street and the building. I mean, there are some basic building blocks, if you will, that make sense whether they're on the highway, whether they're on Midway, or whether they're on some other commercial street. And so the downtown, though, has a unique topography in terms of, or typology, in terms of the buildings, building placement, the scale of buildings to the right-of-way, right? There's something fairly unique about that. And if we're going to, as a community, say that's a thing that we want to enhance and embellish on and protect, maybe it needs some additional language beyond what we have.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
Any other comments or questions? That concludes the Planning Commission meeting for this week, or this month. Our next meeting is on August 27th. At this time, I close the public hearing.